Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the book launch for Ben Jackson's new book, The Case for Scottish Independence, A History of Nationalist Political Thought in Modern Scotland. It is an excellent book, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion about it this evening. This event is sponsored by the Modern British History Seminar at the University of Oxford and also the Political Thought Seminar, though of course we are broadcasting across the world to many people in many different places. Ben Jackson, of course, needs no introduction. He is Associate Professor in Modern History at University College, Oxford, and he is the author of many books, including Equality and the British Left, Making Thatcher's Britain, and the book that we are launching today. He also has the distinction of being my PhD supervisor. And joining us today, we have two distinguished guests. We have Scott Hames, lecturer in Scottish literature at Stirling University and author of The Literary Politics of Scottish Devolution, which was published with Edinburgh University Press in 2019. And we also have Rory Scothorne, who is working on a PhD at Edinburgh University on the relationship between the radical left and Scottish nationalism between the 1960s and 1990s. And he has written widely on Scottish politics and history for the London Review of Books, the New Statesman, and The Guardian. So the running order today is that we will have Scott speaking first and Rory speaking next, and then Ben will join in with some comments and reflections and responses to the audience, and then we will open it up to the group for questions. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat, in the Q&A that you have on your screen. And without further ado, let's hand the floor over to Scott. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Lise. And first of all, congratulations to Ben. This is a tremendous achievement. I'm very excited about the new possibilities this opens for Scottish intellectual history and cultural history, quite apart from its value in political history. As Lise mentioned, I'm not really a political scientist or an historian. I work on literature, but I got to know Ben's work a few years ago in exploring the cultural politics of devolution, which is a terrain that this book is really distinguished in explaining and clarifying. So I'm just going to say about two things over the next few minutes. One is a bunch of very sincere praise for what Ben has achieved in this book, and reasons for you to all rush out and buy it. And then second, I want to pose an open-ended sort of question by way of thinking about the new questions and I guess research topics that this book opens up. But to begin with the praise, what is fantastically, enormously lucid, very enviably lucid way in which Ben traces both the continuities and the discontinuities of the case for independence, and brings both of those things, the continuities and the discontinuities, back to the surface of political debate. However, he's doing so at a time in which intellectual history probably doesn't have that much purchase in Scottish political debate. And that brings me on to the question that I'm going to conclude with. The book is especially good at capturing the shifting, the trimming, and the reversals of SNP policy over the 1970s and 80s. So there's a nice passage exploring how different SNP manifestos swung, quote, from 1970s centrism to 1980s leftism, back to a 90s, 2000s centrism that in fact mirrors Labour's ideological trajectory. And if you know Ben's work, you will know that this is a running theme of his analysis, that there is a very curious and little remarked upon, I would say, kind of twinning between the fortunes of the SNP and Labour, who are not simply foils to one another, but as argued previously, the SNP have in certain respects inherited a model of Scottish practiced and developed by the Labour Party, and they've stolen their clothes electorally in that vein. The book also, and I think even more importantly, reconstructs some of the lost continuities of continuities of nationalist thought, as I would put. It's a book that reminds me very serious, where those debates are not very often. We're now so accustomed.
We seem to be having Scott sort of coming
viewing
in.
the SNP as an extremely professional and extremely effective electoral machine, that our attention naturally is drawn to where the action is, and that's its discipline, as the party at times struggles, although doesn't struggle that hard, to keep its huge but somewhat fractious coalition satisfied. There are rigorous ideological debates underpinning all of that, but they do need excavation, and Ben Jackson is the person to bring them back to the surface in this enormously refreshing and clear-eyed way. But once they reach the surface, in today's light, they almost seem a little exotic or slightly antique. It's a wee bit like reading Peter Mandelson's views on Habermas or something. It doesn't seem to be core to what his political practice is about, or indeed what the SNP is largely focused on at this particular stage of constitutional politics. And indeed, I think you could argue that there are people in the SNP today who could do with a refresher on the things that Ben is uncovering, including, and I'm going to quote a long passage here, previous SNP leaders' sophisticated account of how an independent Scotland would simultaneously enjoy self-determination in certain respects, but in others share institutions, laws, and societies with foreign nations. And here's the crucial bit. This aspect of the political thought of Scottish nationalism gave the independence case greater credibility from the 1980s onward because it acknowledged the realistic limits to Scottish autonomy. Something's gone wrong with my Zoom. I hope that's still working. One of the, I think, real achievements.
Okay, we may have lost Scott for a moment. Please just bear with us. Perhaps he can return.
Am I back?
You are back, Scott. Yeah, your sound is a little bit fractious. I'm wondering if maybe turning off your video would help.
Okay, I'm going to vanish and then finish up what I was saying.
That's great. Thank you.
Is that working? Okay. Okay. Okay, sorry for that. And one of the, I think, really useful sort of gaps that the book fills in our sense of recent Scottish political history is the importance of that groundwork done primarily in the 1980s, included by Gordon Wilson, to build a kind of bridgehead towards a kind of centrist SNP pitch. Many of the debates that are currently animating the Scottish left, you can see very clear precursors for, not only in the 1980s, but in the 1970s, as Ben reconstructs them. So I was saying that acknowledging realistic limits to Scottish autonomy is one of the things that the book recovers. But at this juncture today, I'm not sure the realistic limits of Scottish independence are politically mentionable. They are a slightly forbidden topic, and that's not for intellectual reasons. And that brings me to the question, which is an open-ended question, and it's not a criticism at all. As Ben knows very well, as Ben knows better than most, nationalism is not really an intellectual endeavor. It's often led by intellectuals, but what actually drives and mobilizes national movements is very seldom excellent arguments about popular sovereignty or control of monetary policy and so on. And as someone interested in the culture of nationalism in Scotland, which is something different to Scottish cultural nationalism per se, so I'm not talking about Hugh McDermott or any of his successors, but instead the general climate in which pro-independence claims and arguments are advanced, and the public norms to which they are addressed. And viewed in that horizon, I'm very curious to know how this book will be received. For the past 15 years, the culture of nationalism is really a culture of rationalization rather than one of argument and persuasion. That is to say, it's about finding reasons, finessing the reasons for a pre-existing commitment for many of its supporters. And certainly since 2014, rationalization is the dominant question and area of activity, rather than coming up with sort of first principles arguments and persuasive new reasons to believe. Those rationalizations appeal to established emotional attachments, to Scottish identities and to Scottish distinctions. But those distinctions were, of course, profoundly shaped by British developments, including Thatcherism and deindustrialization. So I'll finish now with a question that I'd like to pose to Ben, is how he sees the intellectual developments that he has so masterfully reconstructed in this book, how he sees them intersecting with those non-intellectual and emotional factors, and how they fit into the present day culture of nationalist thought.
Okay, thank you so much, Scott. And thanks to everyone for bearing with us with a little bit of a Zoom lag. Scott, if you want to turn your video back on now that you're not speaking, see how that goes. If not, we can just listen to your reflections from your black square going forward. Rory, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. That was quite tough to follow, Scott, as eloquent and perceptive as always. I think it's great that Scott's on here as well as Ben, because I think Scott and Ben together have produced two books between them, which really do represent something like a revolution in our understanding of the intellectual history of Scottish nationalism and the cultural history of Scottish nationalism. And Ben talks about this in his own book, where Scott is really focusing on the dream of Scottish nationalism, the kind of cultural and arts side of things. Ben does an extraordinary job of tying together the kind of long form intellectual construction of arguments for Scottish nationalism with their political consequences, or with their consequences in party politics, policy, rhetoric. And one of the really outstanding things about this book is the clarity and focus with which it explores particular lines of argument and particular recurring themes and motifs in the case for independence, all the way from the interwar kind of foundations of the SNP right up to the present day. So we see, for instance, how these kind of entangled themes of decentralization, community, liberty, smallness move from what is initially a kind of agrarian and small town imagination in the SNP and the movement and parties that go into it, into the more modernizing, statist, at times socialist politics of the new middle class from the 1960s and 70s. And then into the 90s, where the old socialists, in some cases, are now advertising Scotland's potential to promote market-based visions of personal choice and the economics of kind of sleek neoliberal flexibility. But there are kind of still continuous themes in here. You can see intellectuals adjusting familiar lines to new circumstances time and time again. And one of the really valuable things is when you look at some of these arguments in the 60s and 70s, you get a sense of rupture. You get people like Tom Nairn, in particular Neil Acheson, really emphasizing that they're breaking with the old kind of stuffy conservatism of Scottish nationalism. Whereas actually, I think one of the things that Ben does in this book is shows that there was a fairly complicated and thoughtful intellectual inheritance before then that did feed into those arguments. Nairn was not simply pioneering a whole new form of nationalism here. He was actually picking up on themes that people like George Elder Davey had been articulating long before. I think one of the really useful things that Ben does as well is use a source base that's been really underexplored until now, and that is the Scottish political magazines, political and cultural magazines, which start emerging from the 60s, really. And these become a really crucial focus for a kind of culture of critical discourse around the questions of Scottish identity for the new intellectuals that are emerging at this time. And there's more and more people starting to use these magazines, and Scott also uses those magazines. I use those magazines in my research, and Ben's done a fantastic job of tracing the role of those publications and drawing together both political actors, people like Jim Sillars, with folk like Tom Nairn. There's also a really clear generational story here that, as Ben keeps saying, a lot of the key people in this story were born between the 30s and the 50s, and they're now reaching retirement age. A lot of them are now retiring from politics. They are passing on the torch in a lot of ways to new generations of nationalists. And I think, as Scott says, one of the intriguing things about this book coming out now is how little discussion there is of the intellectual inheritance of Scottish nationalism in mainstream Scottish political thought. There's a lot of discussion about the intellectual inheritance of Labourism in Scotland. People still talk about Marxism on the left of the independence movement, but there's little sense in public discussions of what a distinctively nationalist tradition of political thought looks like. So this is an absolutely fantastic engagement in that problem. Another thing is the clear link between the formulation of these ideas and their political implications, as I've said. But also, as Ben ends the book, kind of outlining some of the problems that are now emerging, where, as he writes, how can this more muscular nationalist support base be reconciled with the cautious and gradualist outlook of the SNP leadership? You get a sense here of a set of ideas that have been built up over a very long time. And as you show, Ben, these ideas gradually form themselves into the tradition of gradualism that is now pretty hegemonic, at least in the SNP leadership, which combines now with, really for the first time, the SNP and independents are a mass, genuinely mass and predominant movement in Scottish political life. And that combination of an old intellectual tradition that's really not very well understood with a mass movement that's really quite fluid at the moment is causing problems for the SNP leadership. How can the SNP combine their new kind of highly pragmatic politics of, as Scott says, kind of rationalizing their adaptation to a new world order with a grassroots that they've kind of whipped into life with much greater promises than they actually themselves believe will be possible? If there's one thing I'm particularly interested in here, it is the kind of conditions and infrastructures of this thought. So, Ben, you talk about the key generation that's carrying some of these ideas. You focus really clearly on the magazines as the place in which these ideas are elaborated. And I suppose I'm interested in how the structure of that media world has affected this thought, and how the evolution of those structures have affected Scottish political thought. The intellectuals we're looking at here were born at a particular time, came to political maturity at a particular time, and due to those circumstances, they actually found themselves with time, resources, and opportunities to turn some fairly live political issues like the rise of the SNP, the emergence of Thatcher, into a sustained intellectual engagement with Scottish identity that they could quite easily politicise. And I think that combination of political change with the resources and the time through expanding universities, through an expanding realm of kind of more autonomous print culture, allowed them to propagate some fairly radical ideas in some cases, that had a real impact on political rhetoric and party policy. They were supported by things like the Scottish Arts Council, which gave a fair bit of money to some of these magazines, a welfare state that back then was still relatively generous, and a wider print media that was still, far more widely read than it is now anyway. And one of my questions is maybe, today we live in a very, very different media world, one that is much more or much less conducive to the continuation of intellectual traditions. I think its governing logics are much more marketized, be it through social media, be it through an increasingly cash-strapped print media. Those means of long-form discursive analysis that we see in the 70s and 80s in particular really seem very, very hard to sustain, particularly in Scotland. So you get a situation where, the Scottish print media is now suffering from the same branch plant syndrome that it used to talk about in Scottish industry. It's owned by American multinationals. It's kind of run more and more for pure profits. It's kind of clickbaity. How is that going to affect the continuing development of Scottish nationalist thought? How is it going to affect the appropriation of some of the ideas in this book? If that appropriation is being done in a kind of, in the kind of way that I think social media encourages, which is decontextualized, which is based on whatever elicits the fastest reactions, how will that transform the way in which people think and talk about Scottish nationalism? Is it in fact possible for the SNP to create that culture of internal debate, of complex ideas that I think you detail in previous generations of nationalism? So where might nationalist argument go from here, if I can tempt you to speculate on anything? And is argument as important and as influential as it might have been in the past?
Great, thank you very much, Rory. That was really thoughtful and thought-provoking. Ben, would you like to respond to these excellent comments?
Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, many thanks to Scott, to Rory, to Lise, and for everyone for tuning in today. I should say Nomi Lloyd-Jones, who was supposed to speak today, is unwell, so is not able to be with us this evening, but I hope she feels better soon. I know everyone has got lots of things to do at the moment, so I'm really grateful that everyone has taken the time to participate in this event. I'll say something about what Scott and Rory said in a minute, but I thought maybe it might help, first of all, just to briefly say something about the aims of the book and its main argument, because I know that not everyone will have read the book. Perhaps you're here because you're wondering if you should read it. Perhaps you're here because you'd like a quick summary of it so you don't have to read it. So I'll try and set out a little bit of what I try to do in the book, first of all. And we're very happy to answer questions, so please do write questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to them after I finish. So there are lots of great books about modern Scottish history and politics and about Scottish national identity in particular. And so the obvious question is, why write another one? What is distinctive about this book? What is this book adding? And I think my first answer to that question would be, as Scott and Rory have already indicated, that it's an intellectual history, a history of ideas. Just to oversimplify a bit, I think there are lots of great works about Scottish electoral politics, about Scottish social and economic history, about Scottish literary and artistic culture that I've learned a lot from and that I try to speak to in the book. Notably, as we've already mentioned, Scott's book on the literary politics of Scottish devolution, which I heartily recommend to all of you. But my focus in this book is the history of political ideas. So why choose that approach? I mean, one answer is, you're supposed to write about what you know, and that's what I know about. I know about obscure low circulation periodicals and abstruse texts. But a deeper answer is that I think I wanted to try and demonstrate that this is a dimension that's been missing from the existing treatments of Scottish history and politics, that analytically we can gain quite a lot by looking at the content of political arguments and rhetoric. So to some extent, this touches on what the kind of question that sort of Scott was asking, and Rory a little bit as well, about that kind of why arguments, what's important about arguments. And I think Scotland has had its fair share of intellectually powerful writers, politicians, and activists, and we should give them their due in understanding how Scottish politics has changed across the 20th century. So if there's a small n nationalist impulse behind the book, it's to say that we can write a history of ideas about modern Scotland just as we can about any other society, or indeed about earlier periods of Scottish history. And if you think about the way that modern British historiography has gone in recent years, there's been many works that have tried to kind of integrate that ideological, intellectual perspective to the study of British politics more generally. But I also think that when you delve into that history of ideas, it becomes apparent that these intellectual debates, which are often conducted among relatively small elite groups, have fed through into wider politically influential discourses that have ended up shaping Scottish culture. So there is a bigger claim. So one claim is it's just interesting to look at the ideas because other people haven't done it. The bigger claim is that to understand where Scottish political debate is now, to understand the trajectory of the SNP, to understand the increased salience of independence as a social ideal, we need to think a bit about the intellectual content of Scottish political argument. Now, I don't want to offer a pure idealist account of Scottish politics. It's not Hegel in a kilt. It's about, I think it's important to look at the kind of the interaction between these ideas and the economic and social and political context. So the focus of intellectual history is one distinctive feature of the book. I think the other distinctive feature of the book is that I'm trying to zero in on one strand of Scottish political argument, and that is the case for the dissolution of the Anglo-Scottish political union and the creation of a new Scottish state, or as it is otherwise known, independence. So in the period that the book covers, which is roughly from the interwar period up to the 2014 independence referendum, this aspiration moves from a utopian and eccentric view among a tiny minority to very close to winning the referendum in 2014. And as many of you have probably seen, the opinion polling at the moment, there was another opinion poll yesterday, it seems to show that there probably is a majority now in Scotland in favour of independence. Now, I think there are other ways of telling the sort of story of Scottish nationalism that don't focus on that kind of state-seeking form of nationalism specifically, because you can tell a story about a sort of gradual growth of Scottish national consciousness, and that can take a variety of political forms, including support for an elected Scottish Assembly within the context of the United Kingdom. So if you like, there could be a more evolutionary story, and you might then look at kind of different people to the people that I look at in the book if you wanted to tell that evolutionary story. But my decision, which I did wrestle with a bit, but in the end where I came down with is I wanted to focus on independence specifically, because what I was trying to emphasize in the book is that the rise of independence as an ideal represents a pretty radical shift in Scottish political argument. So one book that had a big influence on me, which I know some of you out there will know, is Colin Kidd's book, Union and Unionisms. And Colin Kidd sets out very clearly in that book that until late in the 20th century, the distinction between unionism and nationalism in Scottish political thought was very blurred, in the sense that there was a kind of broad amorphous ideology of unionism that was hegemonic, but it was an ideology that recognised and sought to promote a distinctive Scottish national consciousness at the same time. And equally, Kidd points out in that book that early Scottish nationalism, so in the interwar period in the 1940s, in a way also had its unionist dimensions, because there were some influential parts of that nationalist movement that were keen for Scotland to take a separate place within the broader structures of the British Empire. So what follows from Kidd's book, as I read it anyway, is that something historically interesting happens from round about the 1970s onwards, in that you get a serious ideological challenge to that hegemonic unionism. And then if you kind of follow the story through, that ideological challenge gets to the point where today it's commanding over 50% of the vote in Scotland, according to opinion polls. So the story I wanted to look at is how how did that fringe position in favour of Scottish independence become more intellectually and politically sophisticated over time, and in a way became normalised as a sort of broad movement within Scottish society. Now, to get the full story of that, you'd have to read the whole book, of course, but let me give you a flavour of what I think the kind of answer to that question is. Like other major political movements, Scottish nationalism has been ideologically very diverse. There's always been dry economic technocrats as well as card-carrying members of the literati. But what I try to show in the book, and this is what Rory was also mentioning a minute ago in his remarks, is that there is a generational shift from the early founding generation in the 30s and 40s, when you have figures like John McCormack and Robert McIntyre, who they kind of present independence. That early generation of the SNP present independence as a goal that's about escaping from mass bureaucratic politics in favour of a more libertarian individualist society. And that kind of spirit of individualism they actually see as quite in keeping with Scottish cultural traditions. But there is then, I think there's then a shift, as Rory was saying, in the 60s and 70s towards a new generation who rise, who actually favour independence for different reasons, because they want to make Scotland more like other Western European polities, in the sense that they want Scotland to have a sort of, as they would see it, a properly democratic constitution, and the power to shape economic outcomes. And of course, the implicit argument there is that they think the UK state does not have those features, that it does not have an adequately democratic constitution, and it doesn't sort of exercise the powers of the modern state to shape economic outcomes sufficiently. So these are figures, some of the people that I look at are figures such as Neil Asherson, Isabel Lindsay, Neil McCormack, Stephen Maxwell, Tom Nairn, Alex Salmond, and Jim Sillars. These are really the major writers and politicians who crop up in the book, who forge that new understanding of Scottish nationalism. And they make the case that while they're enthusiastic about Scottish history and culture, of course, they don't think that is in itself enough to motivate a broad-based popular campaign for a separate Scottish state. So instead, they draw on left-wing ideas about democracy and equality to argue for independence. So initially inspired by 1960s New Left ideas about a more decentralised and participatory democracy, they reject the modern British state, the UK state, as an imperial relic that had failed to modernise. And also, these are people who also feel themselves outside of the Labour Party and see the Labour Party itself as an institution that's complicit with that undemocratic imperialism. And this is the famous Anderson Nairn thesis in New Left Review that is very influential, I think, on Scottish nationalist rhetoric. And that, I don't know if anyone's been reading the New Left Review, but the new issue that just came out has this massive article by Perry Anderson where he restates the Anderson Nairn theses and engages a bit more with Scotland, and also cites Rory. So we should, if you haven't read it, it's worth a look. So that starting point of this generation of Scottish nationalists, kind of New Left, decentralist, participatory starting point, then shifts when you get to the 80s and in the Thatcherite period, when deindustrialisation takes hold. You get a more traditional social democratic or kind of labourist layer of argument that sees independence as about trying to recover an egalitarian welfare state. And then even later than that, you get a kind of international dimension that becomes central to nationalist thought in the 90s, as major figures in the movement perceive that European integration offers opportunities for small states to benefit economically from the single market, while enjoying an equality of political status with larger members of the EU. So at that point, you get this idea that independence is also a way of improving Scottish economic performance in more conventionally capitalist terms. So that's the quick kind of take of the various layers of argument, and obviously happy to talk about the details in questions. But I think what I'm, just to kind of sum up, what I'm trying to bring out in the book is, I think there are also ideological tensions within Scottish nationalism. So the story isn't just a kind of irresistible rise of independence as a force. It's more about successive attempts by the proponents of independence to try and frame the project in a way that would have popular resonance. But I do think the 1980s and the experience of Thatcherism is fundamental to that process to creating the popular resonance of nationalist arguments. Before Thatcherism, Scottish nationalists spent a lot of time wrestling with very deep questions about Scottish history, worrying about why there's no nationalism in Scotland, worrying about how to criticise the Union when, as part of the United Kingdom, Scotland had many notable achievements to its credit in such as the Scottish Enlightenment or the kind of great modernisation that took place under industrialisation. And writing in 1980, Tom Nairn noted that there was a kind of paradox to a lot of this Scottish political argument, because he said that nationalists found themselves unable to deploy Scotland's greatest achievements in their ideology, because Scotland's greatest achievements, like the Enlightenment or the great era of capitalism, that was irredeemably stained by its association with British imperialism. But then Nairn also said, on the other side, the anti-nationalist or anti-independence forces actually used Scotland's great achievements to discredit the notion that there could ever be possible any kind of independent Scottish achievement. And so there is this, I feel, but by the time you get to the 80s, there is this sort of impasse in this historical argument in nationalist circles. And I think what Thatcherism does is it basically enables Scottish nationalists to bypass a lot of that, a lot of those debates, because the process of deindustrialisation that the Conservative government presides over creates a sense of injustice and grievance that can be directly attributed to the UK state. But I think what's important to note about the impact of Thatcherism and the way that it provides that motivating force for Scottish nationalism is that it also shows that from the 1980s onwards, in some ways, I think the key arguments that Scottish nationalists make are more democratic than economic. So the powerful argument that unlocks a sense of separate Scottish political identity in that period isn't sort of substantive opposition to Thatcher per se, but it's the argument that the imposition of Thatcherite policies lacked a democratic mandate in Scotland. And that is an argument that is championed as much by Scottish Labour as by the SNP in the 80s and 90s. But I don't think people realised this at the time, or some people did, but not many people realised at the time that is an argument that once you start down that road has extremely radical implications, since it's basically saying that the UK state has no right to rule Scotland unless it's supported by a majority of MPs who are elected there. And some of the kind of more perceptive commentators at the time recognised that argument takes you quite a long way to an argument for independence, even though at the time it was used as an argument for devolution. And that argument became so pervasive in Scottish political debate that it returned with a vengeance the next time the Conservatives returned to government in Westminster in 2010. And so it kind of lived on in Scottish public life in the run-up to the 2014 referendum. So I think, in a sense, we can think of Scottish nationalism as in some ways similar to wider shifts on the political left at that time in Britain and around the world. Scottish nationalism is moving in a similar direction to organisations like Charter 88, to the more general rise of the language of human rights, the turn to the politics of recognition and difference. And from that perspective, you can see Scottish nationalism as being part of wider global and British shifts, as well as reflecting the particular trajectory of Scottish society. But I think what that also shows is the scale of the problem that the UK state and unionism now has, insofar as the standard argument that's deployed against Scottish independence is now economic in character, that there's going to be very high transition costs to creating a new state. And that new state will end up with much lower levels of public spending, have a lower tax base, won't be as generous in its level of public spending as the UK state is at the moment. But I think it's now an open question if that line of argument is as persuasive as its proponents think it is, given that, as I've said, a lot of the force of the nationalist case actually derives not so much from these socioeconomic arguments, but from these democratic arguments about democratic self-determination. So that's just, I mean, I don't want to, we can prognosticate in the discussion period if people want to ask about that, but I think that is, maybe one of the kind of political punchlines that you end up with at the end of the book. And maybe why don't I stop there and we'll take some questions, and maybe I can, because I see there's a few questions piling up, I'll come back to the things that Rory and Scott said maybe later on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. We have got a few questions coming in here. Please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Oh, good, we've got a few more coming in. Great. Just to, before we go to questions, I mean, my reflection on the book, which I massively enjoyed reading and actually found really easy to kind of read quickly and engage with really easily, is that it was particularly enjoyable to read because as a modern British historian, it provided a really nice angle on a large swath of 20th century political thought, and particularly more state critical elements of it, with lots of resonances to other kinds of ideas. I guess I wonder to what extent we can read the strains of Scottish nationalist thought discussed here as, refractions of broader strands of, left criticism or other aspects of sort of a British left political thought, or to what extent do they represent a really distinctive and unique political tradition? I'll take Jim Tomlinson's question following on that, because I think in some ways it relates. So Jim says, you emphasize the role of the New Left Review and the Anderson-Nairn thesis as the intellectual origin point for Scottish nationalism in this worldview, which, as Ben says, is just repeated by Anderson in the latest, his latest 70-page New Left Review missive. Britain is an unreconstructable labourist failure, and this provides a handy rhetoric for Scottish nationalism, but is it helpful to I guess, to nationalist or to anybody's understanding of Britain? So I don't know, Ben, if you want to respond to that, and then maybe we can see if Rory or Scott want to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if the question is, or is Perry Anderson and Tom Nairn right in their portrait of Britain, then I think there are definitely a lot of questions one might pose, some of which were posed at the time by E.P. Thompson in his reply to them in the peculiarities of the English. And I suppose I think that there is a sort of unhelpful kind of sense that there's a sort of normative case of how historical trajectories are supposed to unfold that you find in that piece that is to some extent a product of its time and is not something that is as convincing as a matter of history and sociology. On the other hand, clearly it has been tremendously successful as a sort of rhetoric and argument that has been prosecuted by the Scottish left and the kind of nationalist left in Scotland. And I think that it succeeds not just because it's rhetoric, but because it does tap into something. It does capture, I think, some features of the UK state and British history that are very disquieting to people on the left and sort of more progressive liberal types as well, because it sort of taps into the sense that there is an incomplete democratic revolution that was never fully realised and that has had various problematic political consequences. And so I think to that extent, you could say it is a helpful argument, and that indeed provided part of the ideological fuel around New Labour and the rise of the kind of constitutional reform agenda that government prosecuted as well. But I don't know if Rory or Scott want to say anything about that.
Rory or Scott? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah. I think because it's become a kind of a bit of a buzzword, the Anderson-Nairn thesis. Occasionally it gets collapsed now into one big thesis. Whereas actually what's tended to happen is Scottish nationalists have cherry-picked it. And I think understood within a kind of broader sweep of both Anderson and Nairn's work, there's lots of interesting stuff in there that also poses enormous problems for Scottish nationalism. One of the really interesting things about the use of Anderson-Nairn in Scottish nationalism is how carefully they avoid the elements of it that are equally problematic for their own case. One of which I think is Anderson's particular hostility towards electoralism. You know, Anderson argued, I think it's in Antinomies of Antonio Gramsci, where Anderson is really goes after electoral democracy as the kind of ideological linchpin of capitalism. He says that this is the thing. Parliamentarism is the thing that allows people to believe that they are really participating in the public sphere as equals with their bosses and with their landlords and so on. And this is one of the key things that stops the masses, or this was during their masses phase, I think, it stops the masses from coming up with an identity for themselves that could act politically outside of the parliamentary realm. So this was part of a broader New Left critique of representation as a form of political activity. So I think a part of Anderson, in particular, Anderson's contribution to the Anderson-Nairn thesis, is a critique of representative politics, or specifically parliamentary representative politics. Now, and part of their argument is that Britain has never developed a republican political consciousness, and so it can't have a revolution because the structure of the British state, the ideological foundation of the British state, is such that people can't really conceive of themselves as acting politically outside of Parliament. And so they're always contained within this kind of backstop for the status quo. And the trouble for Nairn, I think, that he never really deals with is that Scottish nationalism emerges as a serious political force in almost purely electoral terms. You know, Scotland understands itself as politically different from the rest of the UK because it votes differently, in the 80s in particular. But from the 70s onwards, the SNP's breakthrough is in a Westminster election. All of this stuff goes through the same processes of ideological obfuscation that Anderson is critiquing. And Nairn's argument is kind of that if we can break away from Britain, Scotland will automatically have a more normal political consciousness, a more European-style political consciousness where the people can act independently of their representatives. There's actually very little evidence for this over the period of Scottish nationalism's development. There is no mass uprising outside of the parliamentary realm that constitutes Scottish nationalism at any point. If you look at the Upper Clyde shipbuilders working, and that's about the closest they get to a kind of extra parliamentary push. But that is really ambiguously nationalist. I mean, it's kind of quite claimed by the Communist Party, who are really kind of unionists at this time. So I would say that the Nairn-Anderson thesis is quite complicated in these things.
Can I add one thing to that? I'm not sure if this is working.
It's working.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'm frozen on my screen, but whatever. Just a tiny addendum to that, which I think was a brilliant answer, especially one feature of devolution and the articulation of nationalism through devolution is a kind of resurfacing and sprucing up of fairly conventional and boring liberal democratic arguments, so that by the end of the 90s, people who were pretty radical in their political outlook in the 70s and 80s have come round to sound like liberal Democrats when they are rather overestimating the new break and the new possibilities represented by the Scottish Parliament. To come back to Jim's question very briefly, you mentioned Nairn and his famous view that the British state is completely beyond salvation or reform. I asked him about that a few years ago, and he very slightly resiled from the view that it was unreformable because devolution represents a kind of reform. But I think he was actually right at a deeper level in that the British state at the level of its machinery got an upgrade, but that underpinning liberal democratic ideology and its relationship to territorial publics did not get an upgrade. In a nutshell, the union got upgraded, unionism didn't, and that's why the union's going to die. I have something written about this, so I won't bang on about it here, but that side, I think, actually endorses a large element of the Nairn-Anderson thesis.
Great. Okay, so the questions are coming in fast and furiously. We've got one here from Anthony Barnett, but I want to first try and collect a couple of questions that relate to questions about empire. So we've got a question from Lynn Jones. Do you think the case for Scottish independence has grown largely because it is becoming more and more evident that there is no convincing intellectual case for the UK state to continue in its present form? And then Andrew Seaton writes, hi everyone. Ben, have you found any acknowledgement of Scotland's historic role in empire as something that needs reckoning with on its own terms, or is that just separated out as a purely British phenomenon? There's always seemed like a tension within the Scottish nationalist arguments about imperialism to me. So I don't know if you want to take either one of those or both, whatever.
Yeah, I'll try. Let me try and answer them both. I guess so. On the first one about whether the in some ways, I think it probably connects to what kind of Scott and Rory were asking me about as well, which is in a way how important is intellectual argument in all of this, in the political outcomes that we see in the world, we see in Scotland at the moment, and how far there's been a sort of the intellectual energy behind the case for Scottish independence and a decay in the case for the Union forms part of the causal story. So I guess I think it is. I mean, it is part of the story, but it's not everything. And I think it would be remiss not to acknowledge that I think there's a series of contingencies that have brought us to the present impasse or condition of Scottish politics. And I think in particular, a series of very serious political mistakes by the Scottish Labour Party. It gave the SNP the space in which to create the current hegemonic position that they now enjoy. So I don't think there was anything inevitable about independence emerging as the kind of prominent social ideal that is at the moment. It was an ideal that seemed persuasive, but it generated a rhetoric that actually Scottish Labour was able to grab hold of and use in the 80s and 90s, and that I think a more adept political operation in Scottish Labour after devolution would have recognised that they should have occupied a more quasi-nationalist space, and that probably would have, for some period of time anyway, blocked off the rise of the SNP in a sort of analogous way to the way that the Welsh Labour Party has created a kind of distinct Welsh Labour identity. So in that sense, I think that the ideas go out there and they're picked up and used by political actors, but there's all sorts of kind of contingencies and to do with kind of political positioning and the context that shapes where the ideas play out. I mean, on empire, probably this is the kind of thing that Rory and Scott could talk about as well a lot. But I completely agree that I think there is a tension within Scottish nationalism, because I think on the one hand, what Tom Nairn always argued, and if you like, the official line of Scottish nationalism is that Scotland should acknowledge its place as complicit in the crimes of British imperialism, and the reason that Britishness as a phenomenon is falling apart is because it's intrinsically imperialistic and tied in with empire. And so the official line is Scotland was, as Nairn famously put it, a junior partner in British imperialism, and the collapse of the empire has removed any purpose to the UK state, and so provides the kind of ground on which a Scottish identity, a Scottish political identity emerges. But I think that, and so one of the things that Nairn always said was to kind of reprimand Scottish nationalists who said that Scotland was a colony. But I mean, there is a bit about this in the book. I think that, there are some Scottish nationalists who just find it absolutely irresistible to use colonial rhetoric and to say that an important way of understanding what's happened to Scottish culture and Scottish society is the result of a kind of, Anglo-imperialism. And I think those two things do kind of coexist. But the official line, if you like, is supposed to be Scotland is not a colony, but the ideological credibility of Britishness has been hauled below the waterline because of the loss of empire.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? Big question.
I can chip in.
Sure.
One of the really interesting things about that particular phase in nationalist development, which I think Ben captures quite well, is this desire for Scotland to have a certain amount of honesty about itself and face the world as it really is. And part of that involves coming to terms with Scotland's role in empire and things. But there's a good nationalist twist that they put on it when they say that one of the things that's stopping Scotland from understanding the world as it really is the Union. And that Scotland's kind of peripheral place within Britain is one of the things that's generating all these nationalist myths and so on. And so the only way to really come to terms with Scotland's quite depressing reality, including its complicity in empire and so on, is through a kind of nationalism, a kind of realist, modernist, thoughtful nationalism. And so Nairn, as early as 68, is before he's officially a nationalist, is calling for a socialist nationalism that gets rid of all the myths and sees Scotland how it really is. And he himself kind of has his own triangulated version of this, where he says that actually the real problem with Scotland is that it's self-colonized, and you know, no one else colonized us. We did it to ourselves, which makes you wonder on whose behalf. And so there's always a kind of nationalist get around with these things where they can fold it back into some kind of nationalist argument.
Okay, shall we move on? So we have a question in the chat from Anthony Barnett, who features in the book himself. So Anthony asks, Scott says that most people rationalize their emotional commitment, but there is an exception. Tom Nairn was persuaded to change his mind, and he writes about this, as you say, in an incredibly useful book by Stephen Maxwell. That's slightly confusing. I'm not sure if you know what he's talking about there, Ben. Do you know more about their meeting in the process of Maxwell's talking down Nairn from his commitment to the totality? That might be quite a specific question for Ben, but I don't know if you want to have a go.
Yeah, sure. I don't know. Maybe Rory knows about this, or Scott knows about this as well. But I think, you know, Nairn and Stephen Maxwell, who are two of the major figures in the book, start off in slightly different places, but kind of end up in the roughly similar place by the time you get to the 80s and 90s. And I mean, so Rory mentioned it a minute ago, actually. I mean, Tom Nairn starts off as this kind of very acerbic critic of what he sees as the kind of ludicrous qualities of the SNP and aspects of Scottish nationalism. And then over the course of the 70s becomes more sympathetic to it, while Stephen Maxwell starts off as a kind of card-carrying SNP person. He's the SNP press officer in the early 70s. He's an SNP councillor. He's, you know, much more of a kind of party man, I suppose, in that sense. And he seems to be a very kind of intellectually interesting man who's sort of thinking about different ways in which you might try and kind of create or frame a kind of popular Scottish nationalism. And initially, he seems quite interested in a more culturalist form of Scottish nationalism, and is a bit sceptical of the idea that Scotland is very intrinsically left-wing. But over the course of the 70s, he and Nairn sort of meet as Maxwell comes to think that the sort of left-wing political identity is the route to take in terms of how to popularise Scottish nationalism. And Nairn comes to, from the left position, to see nationalism as a kind of popular democratic force that can introduce important systemic changes to the British political system. So I think that's the kind of sort of dialectic that unfolds across the 70s. And Stephen Maxwell writes a review of Nairn's The Breakup of Britain, which you know seems to be the kind of which was in 1977, which kind of is the moment where he kind of sets out why he thinks that Nairn is onto something, which is that you don't need to kind of push a culturalist line as a Scottish nationalist, because there's just such a kind of clear and obvious sense of Scottish distinctiveness out there in all different aspects of Scottish society. So the kind of line to take for Scottish nationalists, he thinks, and I think somewhat inspired by Nairn, is not that kind of historicist culturalist view, but the kind of view that the kind of ruthless economic calculation view that the economic welfare of the Scottish people would be improved if it went out of the Union. I could talk about that for some time, but maybe that's enough about the details of Tom and Stephen Maxwell.
Barnett has clarified down in the chat that what he really meant with that question was simply that Ben's book is tremendous. So thank you for that, Anthony. We have a couple of questions about Europe. Cole Murphy asks, to what extent did the issue of Europe contribute to the intellectual case for Scottish independence, and where does the issue of European integration sit? Obviously, a big question. One theme of the Nairn-Anderson theses is the implicit/explicit comparison between the undemocratic UK constitution and the modern post-1789 European state. For Nairn, the UK should be more like a modern European state. But Holmes says, I believe Jim Sillars was a Eurosceptic. So it'd be interesting to hear from the panelists on Europe and Scottish independence. And David Miller just asks, I'd like to ask Ben to say some more about the importance of EU membership to the case for independence. So that's obviously a pretty big topic here. So maybe all the panelists would like to come in on that. Well, if you want to.
Yeah, do you want me to go first? I mean, I'll go first. I mean, there's a fair bit in the book about this, because again, as with many other aspects of the history of Scottish nationalism, it's a bit of a saga with many comings and goings. And Jim Sillars is a very interesting and emblematic figure, I think, in this respect, because Sillars sort of moves from a position of opposition to British membership of the European Community in the 70s. When he's a Labour MP at that time. He then departs from the Labour Party to form the Scottish Labour Party, which is a sort of attempt to find some sort of left-wing nationalist space between the SNP and the Labour Party. And a key element of that departure is making the case that European integration completely changes the game for how we should think about Scottish independence and Scottish self-determination. So Sillars in the Scottish Labour Party, and then when he moves into the SNP, promotes very heavily the idea that European integration is actually a major strategic victory for Scottish nationalists, and he's very persuasive. Other people in the SNP are also persuaded of that. There's a sort of broader shift in SNP opinion away from Euroscepticism across the 80s, and there's a hard-headed realism to that, which is they recognise that if Scotland becomes independent but remains part of the customs union and trading arrangements of the EU, it will minimise the amount of economic disruption that would happen and wouldn't require a hard border with England. And so I think there is a I mean, this is the case that some Brexiteers will make, is that the pursuit of Brexit actually is a strategic setback for Scottish independence, because it makes it much harder to make the kind of economic case, because you will need to have some kind of hard border between England and Scotland. And interestingly, by the time of the Brexit referendum, Sillars has changed again and is actually advocating leaving the EU. So I think his position now is that an independent Scotland should be an EFTA. And he has some, so it's kind of interesting, because even though he was a great advocate of the SNP embracing European integration, I think there was always a note of reservation in the 80s when he said that, in that one of the things he liked about Scotland being an independent member of the European community was that Scotland would have a veto and could stop things happening. And one of the things that Sillars doesn't like is that the power of the national veto has been reduced in recent years, so thinks we should leave the EU. So I think it does now, but there are now, this is a very serious question for the SNP and for any prospective next referendum, which is how do they deal with this question of EU membership and the hard border? And I think those are some of the hard questions that will be pressed on the SNP in the run-up to any putative second referendum.
Scott, would you like to come in on this?
Just very briefly, I think Ben puts it exactly right. Brexit is a massive shot in the arm for the political arguments for independence, but clearly generates some very substantial obstacles to the economic arguments for independence. But as Ben was saying a little while ago, or perhaps it was Rory, at this point, the sort of active case for independence is overwhelmingly political and identitarian rather than economic. So I don't think it'll be until a putative second referendum that the public really grapple with this question. But I'm certain that the SNP are worried about it.
Any thoughts, Rory?
I suppose coming at it from, my research is mostly on the radical left and how people saw the radicalism of both nationalism in general and independence. There's an interesting strain of kind of anti-statism to some left nationalist arguments for the EU. Nairn's big engagement with Europe was in the case against Europe, where he kind of takes the left to task for being opposed to European integration. And his argument is basically that this is in 73, 72, one of those. And his argument is really that we're exiting the age of nationalism. I mean, he was an inconsistent prophet, and we're exiting the age of nationalism and entering the age of kind of supranationalism. And one of the good things about Britain joining Europe is it will basically dissolve Britishness into Europe almost. And again and again, you find left-wing Scottish nationalists in particular arguing that one of the good things about European engagement will be its effect on Scottish intellectual life, that it will force Scots to look outwards again, that growing international cooperation will impose upon Scottish nationalism a kind of outward-looking cosmopolitan and civic set of values that will allow it to escape the risks associated with nationalism. So the EEC doesn't just pose kind of ways of resolving the economic problems and some of the political problems, it also resolves some of the moral issues that these intellectuals have or cosmopolitan intellectuals typically have with nationalism. It allows them to say, well, we'll have to join Europe, so we'll therefore have to not be kind of really hardcore nationalists because it's the only way it works. So it allows them to be nationalist, but not too nationalist. So it's also useful in that sense for them, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to completely abuse my position as chair right now and jump the queue and just ask a follow on that question, which is that I think that the book really seems to highlight tensions between more state critical forms of English nationalism and later much more statist forms, anti-English nationalism, and later much more statist forms of Scottish nationalism, which are premised on economic and industrial development. And I'm wondering to what extent the EU is necessary for allowing those two quite different ideological strands to kind of coexist within the same nationalist project. So maybe Ben might respond to that briefly, and then I'll go back to that.
Yeah, no, that sounds plausible. I mean, I think the person who writes a bit about this after the sort of Jim Silla's 1980s period is Neil McCormack, who I talk about in the book, who's the legal theorist who was also very active in the SNP and was an SNP MEP, and yeah, his kind of vision of a sort of pluralistic legal and political order in which there are different levels of government. So there's the kind of European level, the member state level, local government. It kind of tells a story that you shouldn't think about sovereignty as being something that's entirely resides in the hands of nation states, but rather is something that's kind of shared and pooled between various different entities. And so in that, I think that line, which has been quite deeply imbibed in Scottish nationalist movement and by SNP politicians, is definitely one that helps you to kind of resolve those tensions, because the idea is that you're going to have, as you were saying, the kind of decentralizing participatory impulses alongside these kind of bigger, larger international blocks that you can be part of.
Thanks, Ben. So I've got a couple of questions here about constitutional issues. So Stuart White has asked, does Scotland now have a constitutional common sense that is different to that of England or the UK, specifically democratic constitutionalist, resting on the idea of popular sovereignty as distinct from the idea of parliamentary sovereignty? And then someone anonymous has asked, is there a way back for the Labour Party, which previously seemed to own the issue of constitutional reform? And if not, will that mean the end of the UK? So two sort of different angles on the constitutional question there. Feel free to jump in, anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I get a first go. I mean, I bet probably, you know, Rory can see something about the Labour Party in Scotland. I mean, and also, I mean, I guess Scott and Rory probably have a better sense than I do of what the constitutional common sense in Scotland is. But you know, as the story that I tell in the book anyway, is that I think if you like, the kind of the myth of the useful historical myth of Scotland as having a distinctive tradition of sovereignty that rests in popular sovereignty, I think has undoubtedly been disseminated quite widely in Scottish political debate and argument, and is kind of accepted as the default starting point, and is one reason why the creation of the Scottish Parliament is quite a powerful moment, because then from the point of view of nationalists, the Scottish Parliament can be seen as the embodiment of that popular sovereignty and the vehicle of that popular sovereignty. So there's this longer historical story that you can sort of trace all the way back to the the kind of medieval period and the declaration of Arbroath, and trace forward into the early modern period. But the story, that the kind of historical narrative that Scottish nationalists tell, is that the tradition of sovereignty was different in Scotland, developed in a different way from the parliamentary sovereignty. It was more shared throughout the populace, throughout the community of the realm of Scotland. So, I mean, I think that probably has been quite widely disseminated. I mean, I don't know what Rory and Scott think about that, but I and you do get the sense that some of these debates start from a slightly different place in Scotland for that reason.
So I can't turn off my camera, so I may as well talk just for a second. No, I think that's exactly right, and it's actually a fascinating question of, what is the constitutional common sense of England? At the moment, it seems a bit like a contradiction. Even to try and think of Brexit as a constitutional project seems like a bit of a stretch to me. It's clearly a vehicle for various other political forces now making themselves felt. But was it really driven by a kind of, widely assented constitutional common sense? I'm not sure. The key thing about English Britishness is not having to worry about it and not having to think about your constitutional identity very much until the news is suddenly telling you about poll results in Scotland. I think Ben does an admirable and very balanced job of demystifying some of the myths that do accrue to that sense of there being an exceptionally nimble and erudite constitutional awareness in Scottish society. During the 2014 referendum, we were told twice a week that it was the most educated and thoughtful democratic polity in the world. I don't think that's true. And if I could twist the argument slightly, that whole idea of a constitutional common sense has really shifted from the domain of Ben's book, which is constitutional history and tradition and all the intellectual arguments that go with that, into a much more saleable cultural identity. So it's a kind of retail sense of Scottishness that says, no, there is a distinctive political culture characterized by X, Y, or Z. And X, Y, or Z can change, whatever the weather. The content, the actual bearings and history of those constitutional positions, the sort of thing that Ben's book recovers, are pretty incidental to its political cash value, because it's operating very much within that political and electoral sphere in which it's about maintaining consensus and buy-in among the Scottish establishment, as well as electoral positioning and difference. And that very durable but very nebulous sense of what Scotland's hegemonic constitutional form of reason is, I think can only really be understood in that context. I don't know if there is a lot more substance to it than
that. I will have a go at the Labour Party question. There's kind of one page in Ben's book that just absolutely nails the problem, really, which is that Labour was once very good at navigating between Scottishness and Britishness in its political identity. And it could boast various thinkers who were very good at doing the same thing, from Norman Buchan, J.P. Mackintosh, right up to, I suppose, if he was a thinker, Donald Dewar, etc., people who could be Scottish patriots or nationalists, and also unionists, and were at times far more literate in Scottish cultural politics and political tradition than their nationalist opponents half the time. I think that was very closely related to the horizon of devolution being on the agenda, that there was an option that combined political Britishness and political Scottishness that was democratic on both sides of that. And that there could be a Scottish democratic expression, self-expression, that was Scottish within Britain. Then they did it, then it worked. And that's kind of, they're slightly stuffed as a result of that, I think. I do agree with Ben that Labour's made a huge number of mistakes along the way, but I do think there's also a structural underpinning to those mistakes. I mean, some of them were unforced errors, but the trouble is that there is no real constitutional horizon Labour can offer that is distinctively Scottish anymore. Devolution was that. Devolution can be just Scottish. It can be just a Scottish, the British state just kind of goes, yep, we'll give you guys that, and you guys sort it out on yourselves. And there were lots of people in Scotland who were just minding their own business, working up the structures of devolution by themselves. Federalism, which is Labour's new hazy horizon, is not a distinctly Scottish project, and it can't be. For it to be federalism, it has to be UK-wide. And for it to be UK-wide, it needs English buy-in. And would that English buy-in be an English federal unit? Then then you're reproducing the problem of what Paul Henderson Scott, I think, said was the problem of being in bed with an elephant, which is that at some point the elephant will, if it chooses to roll over through no fault of its own in the night, it will squash you, and that's the kind of underpinning problem that Labour is not able to deal with now, which is that unless it wants to break up England, so the problem's really down south now for Labour, and increasingly divergent logics of national identification and logics of constitutional politics are posing a very serious problem for them. So I don't know if they have a constitutional road back, barring some kind of unforced SNP errors.
Thanks, Rory. So we have a lot of questions, and we are not going to have the chance to get to all of them. So apologies for that in advance, but I'll just try and collect a few themes here as we go. And please don't feel that you need to respond to all of these, or that you even need to respond or to respond in any length, guys. One question is, where do we place Scottish nationalism in relation to traditional nationalist stances, i.e. pro-European or, within the context, basically, how do you place Scottish nationalism within the context of right-wing nationalisms? How do you sort of distinguish or engage with that? Catherine Shank is interested in whether the kind of unionist nationalism that you describe died with Donald Dewar. We have a couple of questions about, which James Cullis has twice asked us the same question. Do you think the Iraq War and the stance of Salmond was a major point at which Scottish nationalism could go on to present a left liberal stance? And secondly, is there an intellectual difference between Salmond and Sturgeon, which I think is an interesting contemporary question. So feel free to take any or none of those.
Yes, so will I go first? So I think the sort of, I mean, I think that probably Rory kind of partially answered the Donald Dewar one, I suppose, a moment ago when he made that point, that which I agree with, that I think that kind of culture of unionist nationalism ran out of steam in Labour, and I mean, I don't know, it's an interesting question why that happened, but I suppose part of it also connects to the question about the Iraq War. I think that the culture of that period of Labour government was so centralising and so organised around the importance of sticking to a unified team line that there wasn't as much space for the expression of those kind of distinctive differences. Because actually, one very simple way in which the Scottish Labour Party could have signalled its distinctiveness was by opposing the Iraq War, but organising a symbolic vote on, or supporting a symbolic vote in the Scottish Parliament against the Iraq War would have been, in retrospect, that would have been worth a lot to have in the pocket in 2014. But they didn't do that. Instead, the view was you have to kind of take the line from London and stick to the line from London. So I think what the SNP was better at was coming up with these specific policy areas where they could signal difference. So tuition fees is the famous example, even though the kind of underlying overall outlook of the SNP is actually, I think, not that different from New Labour, but the overarching rhetoric and the kind of positioning as expressed through certain symbolic policies was much more sort of artfully done. I'll stop there.
Does anyone else want to come in on any of those questions?
I'll just repeat that's a perfect example, I think, of the SNP opposing the Iraq War, of the pattern that Ben traces throughout the book. And what Samad was doing on Iraq as well as tuition fees was really voicing criticisms of New Labour that would have been traditional Labour positions. So without changing the script or the kind of political values very much, the SNP, they didn't have to work too hard to steal the clothes of Labour, because they kind of inherited what were cast off. There was a gap that opened itself ideologically in Scottish politics, and it coincided with an opportunity to create a distinction and to re-energize the moral crusade of independence in a very timely way. And it was hugely effective. I can remember being a PhD student at that time, and a lot of people on the left started to take the SNP much more seriously after that moment.
You all right, Rory? You want to come in, or should we move on?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say that I think in terms of just confidently distinguishing itself from London on policy terms, Scottish Labour's again in a bit of a pinch, because it's very easy to repeat the kind of feeble 50 claims that it would risk exposing the limits of devolution. I appreciate that Scottish politics is largely governed by symbolism rather than actual achievement, but I think there is a real risk for Scottish Labour if they tried back then to pursue kind of clear red water, as Welsh Labour puts it, they would have helped the SNP when that dissent achieved very little, and it helped to expose some of the limitations of devolution in the process. But in retrospect, it would have been better than what they did. But you can understand where they were coming from at the time, I think.
So I want to wrap up really soon, but there are just a couple questions here that I do want to kind of give air to. George Papavangelis asks, how did the leading intellectual figures of Scottish nationalism in the late 20th century perceive the Troubles, and what were the intellectual and cultural attitudes towards the potential of United Ireland? And I'm sorry, I'm missing out a lot of questions here. There's so many great questions, but I did want to give light to David Klemper's question. You guys have talked a lot about the role of cultural nationalism, but could you discuss a little bit more about the idea of race, ethnicity, language, and the idea of civic nationalism and how that relates to Scottish nationalism? So respond to that, and then we will wrap up.
I can take that last one really briefly. Cultural nationalism is kind of nearer my own research. The short answer is that I think civic nationalism, as distinguished somewhat in a somewhat fragile and specious way from ethnic nationalism, gains enormously in Scotland from the cultural conditions of the 20th century. There's a whole chapter of my book about this, but essentially it was very easy to articulate a distinctively Scottish social democratic ethos that combined a sense of working class identity and working class injury and a sense of national dispossession in the 1980s. So that what you had articulated alongside civic nationalism as a movement led really by the establishment of Scottish society was a cultural movement which had a more radical and romantic profile, even at times a populist profile, that integrated those claims of difference and autonomy through a language that was grounded in working class culture. And to me, it's the convergence of these two forces that makes the cultural and electoral force behind devolution irresistible going into the 90s.
Can I, before, I'll say something about Ireland, but I realised there was someone who emailed a question to us before the seminar started, who also put it in the Q&A that I should probably just briefly answer. Alex Linklater asked about what was the ideological character of the SNP in the 70s when Alex Salmond joined it, and I'll briefly just say something about that, which is that I think basically the SNP in the 70s was very mixed and very, in some ways, confused ideologically. It didn't have such a clear ideological profile. I suppose the one thing it had that was distinctive about it was unilateralist. And so it drew a lot of energy from the peace movement and those kind of new left type circles, as well as presenting a certain kind of sort of Scottish culturalism and a kind of more hazy sense that the idea is that Scottish nationalism should be a sort of project that's kind of beyond left and right in some sense. And now sometimes you find people saying that in the 70s that the SNP adopted a social democratic identity, and it is true that they started using the word social democracy or the term social democracy to describe their position, but I'm not sure that they meant by that what we mean by that now. So when they said, when some of the SNP figures in the 70s said they were social democrats, it tended to be a way of expressing a kind of moderation in politics and a sort of distance from the kind of political extremes of conservatism and socialism that they saw in British politics. So I think, all of that, I think it raises the interesting question of why Alex Salmond joined the SNP in the 1970s, given that we think of him as a sort of consummate technocrat economist who was primarily interested in presenting economic arguments for independence. And in a way that circles back to what Rory and Scott were asking about, because I think it does suggest that there is there is a kind of rational intellectual level, the level of kind of arguments that you use to legitimate policies, but there are also these deeper questions about identity and psychology. And I think if you look at Salmond's history, it's clear there's a sort of romantic culturalism lurking within that carapace of economics, because he studied medieval history at St Andrews University as well as economics, and so there's clearly a pathway, a gateway into Scottish nationalism that he took that draws on those kind of wider cultural resonances. And then just briefly on Ireland, I don't know if Rory wants to say anything about this, but it's something that I think is often treated very gingerly by Scottish politics, because there is always the anxiety that the sort of tensions in Ireland could very easily spill over into Scotland, where the sort of tension, the kind of Northern Irish problem is to some extent visible and present within everyday life in Scottish society. But particularly we go back in the sort of 70s and 80s period, we're talking about as expressed through football and all the kind of paraphernalia that goes with it. So my sense is that the kind of lefty types were very sympathetic to United Ireland and would be, a lot of the kind of radical left characters had a sort of anti-imperialist analysis of Britain and Ireland, but the mainstream politicians were a bit reluctant to talk about it. And indeed, some of the the leaders of the SNP in the 70s were pretty austere Protestants who didn't have a tremendous, some of them anyway, didn't have a tremendous amount of time for kind of Roman Catholicism. And another of the things that happened to the SNP was it kind of shifted away from that Protestant identity and for example, took up the case of Ireland as indicating how Scotland could succeed when it became independent by following the Irish model.
I could briefly jump in. There's actually loads of really interesting relationships with Ireland. One thing I would say is that the left was quite split and quite wary. You had a lot of people who were disapproved and wanted to be seen to disapprove very strongly of the means that are being used in the north of Ireland in particular, and were very keen to develop a vision of nationalism that was peaceful and civic and avoided any kind of potentially violent myth making and so on, and stirring up ethnic division. They were really, really careful on those grounds. There's an interesting, I would say, a disproportionate number of mostly, I think, almost entirely lapsed Catholics, but folk who'd gone to Catholic school, had grown up in from a Catholic background, who had a kind of fairly close link to the Irish question in those terms, particularly through the civil rights side of things, and identified with that up to a point, and they were quite keen to articulate a kind of rights-based nationalism, I think, but one which distinguished itself from a lot of elements of Irish republicanism at the same time.
Okay, Scott, would you like to jump in on this? And then I think I would like to return the floor to Ben to offer any concluding reflections or remarks he has on this wonderful book. Go ahead, Scott.
I'm finished. I just want to say congratulations to Ben.
Okay, yeah, with that, huge congratulations to Ben on this really, really great book. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. It's an absolutely fantastic turnout and absolutely fantastic questions. Ben, do you have any concluding reflections or the final word that you want to get in there before we conclude?
I just want to say thanks very much to everyone. Thank you for the kind remarks about the book, and thanks everyone for coming along and joining in and posing these questions. And there's a lot I'll be thinking about and mulling over long after this event. So thanks very much.
Ben, are you going to go have a drink somewhere? Can participants join you for a drink somewhere?
Yeah. Not really. No, I mean, we can all in our solitary, in our own places and in our own way celebrate. So you can raise a glass to the case for Scottish independence wherever you are in the world.
Okay, everyone. So thank you very much for that. Huge congratulations to Ben, and if you clap your hands in solitude. If anyone has little hands emojis, feel free to put them up now. But congratulations to Ben. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.